If you're 60 right now, the number in your retirement account might feel like a verdict. Are you ready to retire, or are you headed for a rude awakening? Today, I'll show you what the average 60-year-old has saved up and what it really means once you factor in non-savers, and most importantly, what you actually need for a secure retirement lifestyle. But before we do that, welcome to the UnRetired, where you're not done, but you're finally doing what you want. If you like this kind of honest talk and this kind of stuff, please tap the like button. It really helps more people find this channel. Now, when we talk about retirement savings, there are two numbers that come up again and again: the average and the median. And while they sound similar, they actually tell very different stories about where people really stand. According to Fidelity's most recent data, the average 401k balance for someone in their early 60s is about $246,000, $246,500 to be exact. Now, that sounds encouraging at first. Who wouldn't think nearly $250,000 tucked away is a good thing? But here's the catch. Averages are easily skewed upward by a relatively small group of people with very large accounts. On the other hand, the median, which is the middle point where half people have more and half people have less, is far lower. The median number is closer to $61,000, and that paints a much harder and more realistic picture of where most 60-year-olds actually are. And this is where the debate begins. Some experts argue that even $246,000 isn't nearly enough to sustain a 20 to 30-year retirement, especially with rising healthcare costs and other cost of living. Others counter that the median tells the real story, that most retirees aren't hitting those big benchmarks, and maybe the expectations need to shift. For context, the norm is that you should have about 8 times your salary to maintain your lifestyle. But as we'll see, those benchmarks can really be out of reach for many, and they actually don't always account for the expenses that actually start disappearing once you stop working. So before we panic about the big numbers, let's look closer at what the average and median really mean. To do that, we're going to take 5 different 60-year-olds as an example. The first person in our example has managed to save about $700,000. Maybe they had a high-paying career, maybe they were extremely disciplined about savings, or maybe they just had fewer financial obligations along the way during their career. The second person has about $100,000. Not nothing, but not exactly enough to coast through 25 to 30 years of retirement. And our third person is sitting right at the median at $61,450. That's the middle point. Half of the people have more than this, and half have less. And let's go to the fourth person, who has just $45,000, which might cover a few years of expenses at best. And last but not least, the fifth person has only $17,550, a balance that frankly wouldn't last more than a handful of months for many households. Now, if you add up all 5 of those together, you get about $924,000. If you divide that by 5 people, well, then you get an average balance of $195,500. On the surface, that number looks pretty solid, almost $200,000 in retirement savings. The problem is that the big $700,000 account heavily skews the average upwards, and the median, the one in the middle at $61,450, is a much truer reflection of where most people actually are. And that's the number that we need to pay attention to. Okay, here's some really interesting data. According to a Northwestern Mutual study, more than 1 in 5 Americans, 22%, have less than $5,000 saved for retirement, and another 15% have nothing saved at all. And here's the real shocker. Over half, 56%, admit they don't even know how much they'll need to retire comfortably. That means for millions of people approaching retirement, the gap isn't just financial, it's also about clarity and planning. Now, here's where things really shift. If we only look at people who actually have savings, the average at age 60 is about $195,000, and the median is $61,450. But once we include those with little to or nothing saved, those numbers totally collapse. The average falls to around $39,000, and the median, the point where half have more or half have less, drops to just $15,725. This paints a much starker, more depressing, yet a far more realistic picture of what retirement savings actually look like for most Americans. So, financial planners often point to what's called the 8 times rule. The idea is pretty simple, that by the time you retire, you should have about 8 times your current salary saved. So if you earn $50,000 a year, the goal would be to have about $400,000 set aside. This benchmark assumes you'll keep the same expenses in retirement and that your investments will keep growing. But as we're about to see, this rule doesn't always match real life. But now I'd love to hear your thoughts. Does the 8X rule sound realistic to you? Or does it feel completely out of reach? Drop a comment below. I'm curious to see where you stand on this. Anyway, the problem with the 8 times rule is that it assumes your expenses in retirement are just going to be exactly the same as they are today. But the reality is, that's rarely true. By the time you retire, your mortgage may be paid off. Tuition for the kids is probably long behind you. Weddings or big family expenses may already be covered. The truth is, many of the financial obligations that you carry while you're working will actually disappear by the time you stop working. And that means you probably don't need a full 8 times cushion to live comfortably. So for many retirees, the reality looks a little bit closer to 4 times their salary and not 8 times. If you earn $50,000, that would mean about $200,000 might be enough to support a pretty comfortable lifestyle. Why? Because by retirement, most of the big ticket expenses, that mortgage, the college tuition, weddings, elder care, are often already behind you. Your living costs are lower, and that smaller number may stretch further than you think. The key isn't hitting the perfect 8 times benchmark. It's aligning your savings with your real expenses. All right, if you're finding this helpful, please make sure you hit the like and subscribe and turn on notifications, because here at the UnRetired, I post twice a week with honest insights on money, lifestyle, and purpose after 60. So you won't miss the tips that can help build the retirement that actually fits your life. And here's the most important point. If you're looking at your own balance right now and it feels way behind these numbers, don't panic. Look, you can't change the past, but you can take action now. Even if you're in your 60s, there are steps you can actually take, like adjusting your spending. You can downsize, you can pick up a part-time job and some extra income, or you can make smarter investment decisions. Retirement isn't about hitting some magic number. It's about building a plan that fits your reality. At the end of the day, your savings do not define you. Retirement is about hitting the number. It's about creating a life that actually feels meaningful, secure, and aligns with your values. Whether you're ahead, behind, or somewhere in between, what matters now is making intentional choices from this point forward. Because money is just one part of the picture. Who you are and how you live is truly what defines your retirement. Now, knowing the numbers is one thing, but learning from the experience of people already in retirement can be even more valuable. I put together on the 10 biggest retirement regrets from people in their 70s and 80s, and it's totally eye-opening. If you want to avoid the mistakes that so many people only realize too late, go watch that one next. You'll find it right here.